The canyon walls still held the heat of the day when they brought her to the edge of Devil's Spine, her hands bound with rope that had already rubbed her wrists raw during the 15-mile journey from Copper Ridge. Margaret Sullivan had stopped crying 3 miles back, somewhere between the dried creek bed and the place where the saguaro cacti stood like silent witnesses to her condemnation. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. Sheriff Duncan Falk sat rigid in his saddle, his weathered face carved into an expression that might have been mistaken for righteous determination if you didn't look too closely at his eyes. But Margaret had learned to read men's eyes during her 2 years in the Arizona Territory, and what she saw in Duncan Falk's gaze wasn't righteousness at all. It was the particular kind of pain that comes from losing a son and needing someone to blame when God doesn't provide satisfactory answers. The October sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of amber and copper that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Margaret's black mourning dress clung to her body, soaked through with sweat, and the evidence of 3 days locked in a storage shed behind the general store. She could feel the weight of the child in her belly, 6.5 months of unwanted life that had become her only companion in the week since the town had turned against her. 3 deputies rode with Falk. Margaret didn't know their names. They had been among the men who dragged her from her small rented room above the seamstress shop, who had shoved her through the street while children threw rocks, and women she'd once shared tea with spat at her feet. Their faces were interchangeable now, just another set of features twisted by the collective hatred that had consumed Copper Ridge like wildfire in dry grass. The town had needed someone to punish. Lieutenant James Sullivan, the actual architect of the Fort Breckenridge massacre, had been dead for 4 months, killed by an Apache arrow through his throat while leading a patrol 30 miles south of the settlement. The Apache who killed him had vanished into the mountains like smoke, leaving the good people of Copper Ridge with justice unserved and rage unexpended. And then someone had remembered that the lieutenant had a widow, a pregnant widow, an Irish widow with red hair and an accent that marked her as foreign, as other, as convenient. They stopped at the mouth of the canyon where shadows gathered like pools of spilled ink. Falk dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose knees had started to betray him somewhere in his 5th decade. He walked to where Margaret sat on the spare horse, her hands still bound to the saddle horn. "This is as far as we go," he said. His voice carried the flat affect of someone who had rehearsed this moment but found no satisfaction in its execution. "The Apache knows you're coming. Chief Nalnish sent word 2 weeks ago. He wants the widow of the butcher. We're giving him what he asked for." Margaret met his gaze and held it. "Your son Henry was a good man, Sheriff. He didn't deserve what happened at Fort Breckenridge, but neither do I." Falk's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might actually listen, might actually see her as something more than a convenient scapegoat. Then his hand moved to the revolver at his hip, not drawing it but resting his palm on the worn grip as if touching a talisman. "Henry trusted your husband," Falk said. "Followed him into that massacre because Lieutenant Sullivan was his commanding officer. My boy died thinking he was serving his country. Died not knowing he'd been led to slaughter by a man consumed with hate." He paused, and Margaret saw his throat work as he swallowed something that might have been grief, or might have been bile. "You should have known what your husband was, should have seen it, should have stopped it." "I didn't know," Margaret said, but even as the words left her mouth she tasted their incompleteness. She had known something, had seen the way James's face changed when he drank too much whiskey and talked about the Comanche war party that killed his parents when he was 5 years old, had heard the venom in his voice when he spoke about savages and the necessity of extermination. She had known he carried darkness inside him. She had chosen not to look too closely at its dimensions. One of the deputies, a thin man with a mustache that drooped past his chin, pulled Margaret down from the horse with hands that were neither gentle nor deliberately cruel. She stumbled when her feet hit the ground, her balance thrown off by the weight of her pregnancy and the weakness that came from 3 days of eating nothing but stale bread and water. They tied her to a twisted Joshua tree at the canyon's entrance, using the same rope that had bound her hands. The tree's bark bit into her back through the thin fabric of her dress. Falk placed a canvas water bag at her feet and a small bundle wrapped in cloth that she assumed contained food, though she couldn't imagine eating anything with her stomach churning the way it was. "The Apache will come for you," Falk said. He wouldn't look at her face anymore, directing his words to a point somewhere past her left shoulder. "Chief Nalnish promised that if we delivered you, his warriors would leave Copper Ridge alone. No more burned ranches, no more dead settlers. Your life for our peace." Margaret wanted to laugh at the bitter mathematics of it. One Irish widow, 6.5 months pregnant, worth exactly enough to purchase temporary safety for a town that had already decided she was worthless. Instead, she said, "I need to tell you something. About the baby." "Don't care," Falk interrupted. He was already turning back toward his horse. "Whatever sins you're carrying, they're between you and God now. And the Apache." "The baby isn't James's," Margaret said, and her voice came out harder than she intended, sharp enough to stop all 4 men in their tracks. Falk turned slowly. "What did you say?" "The child I'm carrying. It's not Lieutenant Sullivan's." Margaret felt her face burn but forced herself to continue. The truth was all she had left, and even if it damned her further, at least it would be her truth and not their assumptions. "James died in June. A week after his death, I was attacked by a soldier. Corporal Dutch from Fort Breckenridge. He was drunk. I was alone. I never reported it because I knew no one would believe me. Irish widow accuses American soldier. We all know how that story ends." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind moving through the canyon and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Falk's face had gone the color of weathered bone. "You're lying," he said finally, but there was no conviction in the accusation. "I'm not." Margaret met his eyes again. "I'm a lot of things, Sheriff. I'm complicit. I'm a coward for not speaking up when I should have. But I'm not a liar, not anymore. This baby is the result of violence, not love. But it's innocent all the same, and you're sentencing it to death along with me." One of the deputies, the youngest of the 4, made a sound that might have been protest. Falk silenced him with a look that could have stripped paint. "Doesn't change anything," Falk said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "The Apache wants Sullivan's widow. That's you. What's in your belly doesn't matter to them or to us." He mounted his horse with the stiff dignity of a man trying very hard not to feel what he was feeling. The other deputies followed his lead. They rode away without looking back, and Margaret watched them become smaller and smaller against the vast orange sky, until they were just dark specks that might have been birds or might have been her last connection to the world of the living. The sun touched the western peaks. Shadows rushed across the desert floor like water finding its level. Margaret tested the ropes binding her to the Joshua tree and found them secure. She could move her arms a few inches in either direction, but not enough to reach the knots. Her legs were free, but there was nowhere to run. The desert stretched in every direction, hostile and indifferent, ready to kill her through thirst or heat, or the 1,000 other ways this landscape murdered the unprepared. The baby moved inside her, a rolling sensation that had become familiar over the past months. She had hated this child at first, this unwanted consequence of the worst night of her life. But somewhere in the long weeks of isolation, of eating alone and sleeping alone and enduring the town's hatred alone, the baby had become the only thing that made her human. Without it, she was just a receptacle for other people's rage. With it, she was a mother. Flawed, terrified, condemned, but still a mother. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her belly in the Irish Gaelic her own mother had taught her before fever took her when Margaret was 12. "Tabron orm, a lianb, nior shart go mabid se seo og tarlu duit." "I'm sorry, child. This shouldn't be happening to you." The temperature dropped, as the sun disappeared. October nights in the Arizona Territory could be brutally cold after the furnace heat of the day. Margaret's dress, still damp with sweat, began to chill against her skin. She tried to pull her knees up to conserve warmth, but the ropes restricted her movement. Her teeth started to chatter. That was when she heard the wolf howl. It came from somewhere deeper in the canyon, a long rising note that seemed to contain both music and menace. Margaret had heard wolves before, back in Colorado, where she'd lived before James convinced her to follow him to this godforsaken territory. But this sound was different, closer, more deliberate, as if the animal wanted her to know it was there. The howl died away. In the silence that followed, Margaret became aware of other sounds. The skitter of small creatures moving through brush, the whisper of wind across stone, and underneath it all, something else. Footsteps, human footsteps, moving with a careful precision that suggested someone who knew exactly where to place each foot to minimize noise. A shape detached itself from the deeper shadows near the canyon wall. At first, Margaret thought it was a trick of the fading light, a pattern her frightened mind was imposing on darkness. Then, the shape moved closer and resolved into the form of a man. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the lean build of someone who lived entirely off what the land provided. Long black hair fell past his shoulders, decorated with what looked like small bones woven into thin braids. He wore a mix of traditional Apache clothing and pieces clearly taken from white settlements. Buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt that had once been blue but had faded to the color of desert sky, and boots that had seen better days. But it was his chest that drew Margaret's attention. Even in the dimming light, she could see the 7 parallel scars running horizontally across his ribs, raised and deliberate, the kind of marks that came from ceremony rather than combat. He stopped 10 feet away from her, close enough that she could see his face clearly. He looked younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his mid-20s, with features that would have been handsome if they hadn't been set in an expression of such complete neutrality. His dark eyes studied her with the same detached interest a naturalist might show examining a new species of insect. Behind him, moving with liquid grace, came the wolf. Except as it drew closer, Margaret realized it wasn't quite a wolf. Too large, with eyes that held too much intelligence. A wolf-dog hybrid, she guessed, the kind of animal that belonged to neither the wild world nor the domestic one. The man made no threatening moves. He simply stood there, hands visible and empty, watching her in a way that made Margaret feel more exposed than if he'd been pointing a weapon at her face. She tried to speak and found her throat had closed. The baby moved again, a flutter of motion that felt like panic. After what felt like an hour, but was probably less than a minute, the man reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something. Margaret tensed, expecting a knife, but what he produced was a small leather-bound journal and a piece of charcoal wrapped in cloth. He opened the journal to a blank page, knelt on the ground to use his thigh as a writing surface, and began to write with careful, deliberate strokes. When he finished, he stood and walked closer, stopping just outside the radius of her bound arms. He held the journal out so she could read what he'd written. The handwriting was surprisingly neat. The letters formed with the precision of someone who had learned to write as an adult and took the task seriously. The message was in English. "Can you read?" it said. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. The man turned the page and showed her what he'd written on the next sheet. "I am Dakota. The town gave you to Chief Nalnish, but Nalnish sent me instead. I am the one they call Ghost, the one who will not speak." Margaret found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Are you going to kill me?" Dakota considered the question with the same careful neutrality he'd shown since appearing. Then he wrote again, his charcoal moving across the page with soft, scratching sounds. "Killing you means killing innocent child against my way. But you must survive 30 days. Council decision. If you live, spirits judge you innocent. If you die, my soul is cursed forever." He flipped to a new page and wrote more. "I will not let you die. but you must choose to come with me. I will not force you." Margaret's mind struggled to process what she was reading. This was the Apache the town had sacrificed her to? This silent man with his careful handwriting and his talk of curses and spirits? She had expected savage violence, the kind of brutal justice that the stories spoke of when they described Apache revenge. Instead, she was being offered a choice. "What happens if I come with you?" she asked. Dakota wrote, "I teach you to survive. Water, food, shelter. You must learn 30 days in my canyon home. If you are still alive when the moon completes its cycle, you go free." "And if I refuse?" Margaret heard the absurdity of the question even as she asked it. What was her alternative? Die tied to this tree? Wander into the desert and perish within a day? Dakota didn't write an answer to that. He simply gestured to the vast darkness surrounding them, letting the desert speak for itself. The wolf-dog hybrid had come closer while they communicated. It sat near Margaret's feet now, close enough that she could have touched it if her hands had been free. The animal's eyes were a strange pale gold, almost amber, and they studied her with unsettling intelligence. When it opened its mouth to pant, she could see teeth designed for tearing meat. "What's his name?" Margaret asked, more to fill the terrible silence than because she actually cared. Dakota wrote, "Nash. He is my family. Only family for 3 years." Something in the way he wrote "only family" made Margaret's chest tighten. She had been alone, too, these past months. Alone in a way that went deeper than just physical isolation. Alone in the way that comes when everyone you thought might care about you decides you're not worth the effort of compassion. "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked. "The town expects you to kill me. They gave me to you for that purpose. Why not just do it and be done with it?" Dakota turned to a fresh page. His writing came faster now, the letters less carefully formed, as if emotion was beginning to override precision. 3 years ago I was ordered to kill settler family, mother and 2 children, ages 4 and 6. I went to their cabin, saw the mother holding her babies. She looked like my wife looked when she was pregnant. I could not do it. I lowered my weapon, told her to run." He paused, staring at what he'd written, then continued on the next page. "Warriors called me coward. My uncle carved these scars into my chest. 7 cuts for 7 years I had been warrior. Said I shamed the tribe. I left that night. Have not spoken one word since. 3 years of silence. I chose it as punishment for failing my people." Margaret felt tears burning her eyes. "That's not cowardice. That's humanity." Dakota looked up from his journal, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. In the deepening darkness, she couldn't read his expression clearly, but she thought she saw something shift in his face. Not quite surprise, but perhaps recognition, as if her words had touched something he'd thought was long dead. He reached for the knife at his belt, and Margaret's body tensed involuntarily. But Dakota simply used the blade to cut through the ropes, binding her to the Joshua tree. The fibers parted with small popping sounds. Margaret's arms fell forward, numb and tingling as blood flow returned. She rubbed her wrists where the rope had abraded the skin, feeling the raised welts that would become bruises by morning. Dakota stepped back, giving her space. He wrote again, "You choose. Come with me and live. Stay here and die. But choose now. Night kills fast in the desert." Margaret looked at the water bag and food bundle the sheriff had left. She looked at the empty desert stretching into darkness. She looked at her own hands, red and raw, and felt the weight of the child in her belly. The baby that no one wanted. The baby that 2 different men had condemned to death without ever asking if it wanted to live. She looked at Dakota, this strange silent man with his scars and his wolf dog and his careful handwriting. A man who had been called coward for refusing to kill children. A man who had chosen silence as penance for an act of mercy. "I'll come," Margaret said. "I don't want to die. And I don't want my baby to die. So yes, I'll come with you." Dakota nodded once. He gestured for her to follow and began walking deeper into the canyon, Nash moving beside him like a shadow. Margaret pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady after hours of restricted movement. She took a step and nearly fell. Her balance was completely wrong, thrown off by the pregnancy and the weakness and the terror that was still coursing through her system like poison. Dakota turned back. He hesitated, clearly weighing something in his mind, then moved closer and offered his arm for support. Margaret took it, feeling the wiry strength beneath the cotton fabric of his shirt. He was warm, which surprised her. She had expected someone called Ghost to be cold. They walked through the canyon as full darkness claimed the sky. Above them, stars began to appear in quantities Margaret had never seen back east. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, so bright it cast faint shadows on the canyon floor. Dakota moved with absolute confidence, his feet finding purchase on terrain that Margaret could barely see. Several times she stumbled, and each time he steadied her without comment, without judgment. After perhaps 20 minutes of walking, the sound of water reached Margaret's ears, not the trickle of a stream, but something larger, a roar that grew louder as they continued until it dominated all other sounds. They rounded a bend in the canyon wall, and Margaret saw it. A waterfall, perhaps 60 feet high, plunging from an overhang into a pool that gleamed silver in the starlight. The falling water had carved out a deep basin over countless years, creating a natural reservoir that would hold water even in the driest months. But what caught Margaret's attention wasn't the beauty of the falls or the promise of water. It was what lay behind the cascade. Through the curtain of falling water, she could just make out the darker shadow of a cave entrance, large enough to accommodate several people, protected from the elements, hidden from casual observation. A perfect sanctuary. Dakota led her along the edge of the pool to where the rock face met the falling water. Margaret realized there must be a ledge behind the cascade, a narrow path that would let them pass behind the falls without getting soaked. She looked at the sheer drop to her right, the churning water below, and felt her stomach clench. Dakota seemed to sense her fear. He wrote quickly on a page of his journal and showed it to her. Nash goes first. Watch where he puts feet. Step exactly there. I hold your hand. Trust the horse knows the way. What horse? Margaret asked, confused. Dakota gave a low whistle, and from somewhere in the darkness beyond the falls, a horse whinnied in response. She couldn't see it, but its presence was oddly reassuring. If a horse could navigate that ledge, perhaps a pregnant woman could too. Nash went first as promised, his paws finding purchase on the wet stone with the sure confidence of an animal that had made this journey many times. Dakota took Margaret's hand, his grip firm without being painful, and guided her onto the ledge. The path was perhaps 18 inches wide, which would have been adequate under normal circumstances. But Margaret was 6.5 months pregnant, her center of gravity completely altered, and the rock was slick with constant spray from the waterfall. Each step felt like a negotiation with gravity and fate. She kept her eyes on Nash's retreating form ahead of her, trying not to look at the drop to her right or think about what would happen if she slipped. Dakota moved behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence, far enough that he wasn't crowding her. His hand never left hers. When her foot slipped on a particularly treacherous section, his other hand shot out to steady her back, keeping her upright until she found her footing again. After what felt like a year but was probably less than 2 minutes, they passed through the waterfall's curtain and into the blessed dryness of the cave beyond. Margaret's legs gave out the moment she felt solid ground beneath her feet. She sank to her knees, gasping, her whole body shaking with aftershock. Dakota gave her a moment to recover, then helped her to her feet and guided her deeper into the cave. As her eyes adjusted, Margaret began to make out details. The cave was larger than she'd expected, the entrance chamber opening into a series of connected spaces carved by water over geological time. Someone had lived here for a while. There were signs of habitation everywhere, a fire pit lined with stones, shelves carved into the natural rock, holding what looked like supplies, blankets rolled and stacked against one wall. Dakota led her to the fire pit and began building a small fire with practiced efficiency. He had materials already prepared: dried grass for tinder, small sticks for kindling, larger pieces of wood stacked nearby. Within minutes, flames were dancing in the pit, casting warm light across the cave walls and driving back the chill that had seeped into Margaret's bones. Only then did she notice the drawings. They covered the cave walls in places where the rock was smoothest, charcoal sketches, some crude and others remarkably detailed. Horses in motion, desert landscapes with every cactus and stone rendered with careful attention, animals, birds, the vast sky overhead, and one image repeated multiple times, refined with each iteration as if the artist was trying to capture something that existed only in memory. A woman's face. She was beautiful in the way that photographs could never quite capture, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold both sadness and strength. Her hair was long, falling past her shoulders in the traditional Apache style. In some of the drawings, she was smiling. In others, her expression was more serious, contemplative. But in all of them, she radiated a quality that Margaret could only describe as presence. "Your wife?" Margaret asked softly. Dakota turned from the fire. He looked at the drawings, and for the first time since she'd met him, his neutral expression cracked. Pain crossed his face, raw and recent, despite the 3 years that must have passed. He nodded. What was her name? Dakota hesitated, then wrote in his journal, "Aida. It means first to dance. She loved to dance. Before the soldiers came." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and meant it with a depth that surprised her. She had spent months drowning in her own grief and fear, but looking at these drawings of a woman lost to violence, she felt her heart crack open for someone else's pain. Dakota stared at what he'd written, then added below it, "Your husband killed her. Lieutenant Sullivan led the raid on Fort Breckenridge. His men shot Aida while she tried to surrender. She was carrying our son. 7 months pregnant. They both died." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Margaret felt the floor drop out from beneath her understanding of the world. James had killed this man's pregnant wife. And now here she was, pregnant herself, sitting in this man's home, being offered protection instead of the revenge that every instinct must be screaming for. "I didn't know," Margaret whispered. "I swear to God I didn't know the full extent of what he'd done." But even as she said it, she tasted the incomplete truth of the statement. She had known something. She had known James hated the Apache with a passion that went beyond professional duty or even reasonable caution. She had heard him talk after too much whiskey about the necessity of extermination, about the only good Indian being a dead Indian, about how the territory would never be safe until every savage was driven out or buried. She had known, and she had loved him anyway. Or convinced herself she loved him. And now a dead man's sins were crushing her as surely as if he'd reached up from the grave to wrap his hands around her throat. Dakota watched her face as these realizations moved across it. Then he wrote again, his handwriting slower now, each word chosen with care. "You carry guilt that is not yours. Child in your belly did not choose its father. You did not pull trigger. We both carry dead people's sins. Maybe we can put them down together." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. She had cried so much over the past months that she thought she'd emptied herself of the capacity for more tears, but apparently sorrow was a renewable resource. "I don't understand you," she said through her tears. "I don't understand how you can be kind to me. I'm the widow of the man who killed your wife and your son. You have every right to hate me." Dakota set down his journal in charcoal. He stood and moved to one of the shelves carved into the rock. He returned with a water pouch and a bundle wrapped in cloth. He offered both to Margaret with a gesture that was almost formal in its deliberateness. She took them with shaking hands. The water pouch was heavier than it looked, and when she uncapped it and drank, the water was cold and sweet, tasting faintly of minerals and stone. The bundle contained dried meat, berries, and something that looked like flat bread made from ground seeds. Her stomach, which had been clenched tight with fear, suddenly reminded her that she hadn't eaten anything substantial in days. Dakota watched her eat, then wrote again. Apache law says blood debt must be paid, but Apache law also says innocent life is sacred. You carry innocent life. That makes you sacred too, even if you are enemy. I cannot harm you without harming my own spirit. So I choose to protect instead of destroy. Aita would have wanted this. She believed mercy was stronger than revenge. He paused, then added, Also, you are the first person in 3 years who has spoken to me like I am human. Not ghost, not coward, not shame, just person. That is worth protecting. Margaret looked at this strange, silent man who wrote his thoughts with such careful precision. She thought about the 7 scars on his chest, marks of shame carved by his own people for the crime of refusing to kill children. She thought about the 3 years of self-imposed silence, about living alone in this cave with only a wolf dog for company, about the drawings of a dead wife that covered the walls like prayers. What happens now? She asked when she'd finished eating. Dakota wrote, Now you sleep. Tomorrow we begin 30 days. I teach you survival, water, food, fire, language. Everything you need to stay alive in this land that wants to kill you. If you survive until the moon is full again, council will judge. Naelnish will decide if you go free or if blood debt still requires payment. And if I die before then? Then I am cursed forever, cannot return to my people, cannot join Aita in the next world, will wander between living and dead forever. He showed her what he'd written, then added one more line, So I will make sure you do not die. He gathered blankets from the stack against the wall and spread them near the fire, creating a makeshift bed. He pointed to it, then to Margaret, making it clear this was for her. She started to protest that he should sleep there, that she couldn't take his bed, but he silenced her with a look and a gesture that brooked no argument. Margaret lowered herself onto the blankets with a groan of relief. Every muscle in her body ached, and the warmth from the fire was already making her eyelids heavy. Dakota moved to the other side of the fire pit and settled himself on the bare rock with Nash curled beside him. The wolf dog rested its massive head on Dakota's thigh, and the man's hand moved to scratch behind the animal's ears with unconscious affection. The baby moved inside Margaret, a rolling sensation that had become familiar over the months. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the shape of a tiny limb pressing against her palm from the inside. 7 months. If she died out here, the baby would die too. That thought had been abstract when Sheriff Falk tied her to the Joshua tree. But here, in this cave, with this silent man who had every reason to hate her, but was instead offering protection, the baby suddenly felt achingly real. Dakota, she said softly. He looked up from Nash, his face half in shadow and half lit by firelight. Thank you for not killing us. He stared at her for a long moment, then reached for his journal. He wrote something and showed it to her across the fire. Thank you for seeing me as man who can choose mercy, not monster who must choose violence. Margaret felt fresh tears threatening. She was so tired of crying, but apparently her body hadn't gotten the message. You're not a monster, she said. You're the most human person I've met in a very long time. Dakota's expression shifted, some wall inside him cracking just a fraction. He didn't write anything in response. He just nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he'd forgotten he used to know. The fire crackled. The waterfall roared its endless song. Margaret closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her down into sleep, feeling safer than she had any right to feel, protected by a man who had every reason to be her executioner, but had chosen to be her guardian instead. Margaret woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of water, confused for a moment about where she was. Then memory crashed back like a wave. The town, the condemnation, the canyon, the silent man who had brought her to this cave behind the waterfall. She sat up carefully, her body stiff and aching from sleeping on the ground, despite the blankets Dakota had provided. The fire had burned down to coals during the night, but someone had added fresh wood recently. The flames were small but steady, providing warmth against the morning chill. Dakota was nowhere to be seen, but Nash lay near the cave entrance, his amber eyes open and watchful. When he saw Margaret looking at him, his tail moved once in what might have been a greeting, or might have been simple acknowledgment of her consciousness. Margaret pushed herself to her feet, her bladder urgent with the pressure of pregnancy. She looked around the cave uncertainly, wondering about the logistics of this situation. Dakota appeared at the cave entrance, as if summoned by her need, carrying a bundle of what looked like fresh grasses. He saw her standing and seemed to understand immediately. He set down the grasses and gestured for her to follow. He led her to a smaller chamber off the main cave, a natural alcove that offered privacy. He pointed to a depression in the stone floor that had clearly been used for this purpose before, then left her alone. When Margaret emerged a few minutes later, considerably more comfortable, she found that Dakota had set out what appeared to be breakfast near the fire. More dried meat, berries that looked like they'd been preserved somehow, and a paste made from ground seeds mixed with water. It wasn't what she'd been used to eating in Copper Ridge, but her stomach didn't care about refinement. She was hungry in a way that went beyond normal appetite. Dakota sat across the fire from her, Nash at his side. He had his journal open and was writing something with his piece of charcoal. When he finished, he showed it to her. "Good morning. You slept well." "That is good. Baby needs rest." Margaret nodded, chewing the dried meat. It was tougher than beef jerky, but flavored with something that gave it a faintly sweet taste. "What is this?" she asked, holding up a piece of the meat. Dakota wrote, "Venison, deer, dried with salt and desert herbs. Will not spoil. Can keep for months." "Where did you get salt?" He pointed toward the cave entrance, then wrote, "Salt deposits in canyon, 2 miles north. Desert gives everything if you know where to look." Margaret ate slowly, letting the food settle in her stomach. The baby seemed content, its movements gentle rather than the sharp kicks she sometimes felt when her body was stressed. As she ate, she studied Dakota more carefully than she'd been able to in last night's darkness and fear. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably not yet 30. His face would have been handsome if it carried any expression other than careful neutrality, but it was his eyes that held her attention. They were dark brown, almost black, and they held a quality of watchfulness that suggested someone who had learned to observe everything and trust nothing. The 7 scars across his chest were visible through the open neck of his shirt. In daylight, she could see that they were old but still raised, the kind of deliberate wounds that had been made to leave permanent marks. She thought about what he'd written last night, about his uncle carving shame into his flesh for refusing to kill children, and felt anger kindle in her chest on behalf of this stranger. "How old were you," she asked, "when you refused to kill that family?" Dakota looked up from the piece of wood he'd been examining. He wrote, 23. 3 years ago. Feels like lifetime." "You were barely more than a boy yourself." He shook his head and wrote, "Apache boys become men young. By 23, I had been warrior for 7 years, had killed in battle, had married, was going to be father, was not boy, was man who chose wrong path according to my people, or right path according to dead wife, still not sure which." Margaret finished her breakfast and set the empty bowl aside. "Your wife sounds like she was a wise woman." Dakota's hand paused in its writing. He stared at the journal for a long moment before he wrote, "Aita was wisest person I knew. She learned English from missionaries, taught me to read and write, said language was bridge between worlds. She believed peace was possible between Apache and whites if people would talk instead of shoot." "What happened to her?" Margaret asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, you told me last night. My husband and his men killed her at Fort Breckenridge. I shouldn't have asked." But Dakota was already writing, the charcoal moving faster now, as if he needed to get the words out before he lost courage. "I told warriors where settler camp was, thought we would raid for horses only. Aita heard plan, knew some whites in that camp had children. She went ahead to warn them, give them chance to run. She thought if she spoke English, they would listen. they would trust. He paused, then continued on a new page. Lieutenant Sullivan's men saw Apache woman approaching, shot her before she could speak. I heard gunfire, ran to her, held her while she died. She said, "Do not become like them. Do not let hate consume you." Promised her I would not. But I broke promise for 2 years. Became exactly what she feared. Killed settlers, raided, became the thing that killed her. Another page. Then 3 years ago, stood in settler cabin with gun pointed at mother and children, saw Aita's face in that mother's face, heard Aita's voice saying, "Do not become like them," could not pull trigger, chose her way finally, too late to save her, but not too late to honor her. Margaret felt her throat tighten. That's why you stopped speaking? Because your words led to her death? Dakota nodded. He wrote, "Told warriors where to find settlers. Aita died because of my words, so I chose silence. Seemed like fair punishment." "It's not fair at all," Margaret said with sudden heat. "You were trying to protect your people. She was trying to protect innocents. Neither of you did anything wrong. The men who shot her without asking questions, they're the ones who deserve punishment." Dakota looked at her with something like surprise crossing his features. He wrote, "You defend me even though I killed your people?" "You defended children when your people told you to kill them," Margaret countered. "That makes you better than most men I've known, regardless of which side of this war you're on." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared grief and complicated morality hanging between them. Then Dakota stood and gestured for Margaret to follow. He led her to the back of the main cave chamber where the shelves had been carved into rock. The shelves held an eclectic collection of items, books in both English and what Margaret assumed was Apache, though she couldn't read the latter, tools for starting fire, for cutting, for sewing, dried herbs bundled and hanging from pegs, clay pots containing substances she couldn't identify, a bow and a quiver of arrows, though both looked unused, as if they'd been set aside deliberately. Dakota pulled down one of the English books, a worn copy of Paradise Lost that looked like it had been read many times. He opened it to a passage and pointed. "The mind is its own place," Margaret read aloud, "and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven." Dakota nodded and wrote, "Aita loved this book. Said it explained how people choose their own prisons. Said I was making my silence into prison. Maybe she was right." He closed the book and returned it to the shelf. Then he pulled down something else, a rolled piece of leather that he spread on the ground near the fire. It was a map, Margaret realized, drawn with remarkable precision. It showed the canyon, the surrounding desert, landmarks labeled in both English and Apache. Dakota knelt beside the map and pulled out his charcoal. He pointed to a spot marked with an X. "We are here." Then he drew a circle around the area. "This is 30-day territory. You must learn all of it. Water sources, food sources, dangers, plants that heal, plants that kill, everything." Margaret knelt beside him, studying the map. "You're going to teach me all this in 30 days?" He wrote, "Have to. If you cannot survive here, you cannot survive judgment. Council will test you, make you prove you learned. If you fail, they will say spirits have judged you guilty. If you succeed, they must let you go free." "What kind of tests?" Dakota wrote several items. Find water with no help. Make fire with no tools. Identify safe food. Speak basic Apache. Show respect to land and animals. Prove you are not just white woman who takes and destroys. Prove you can live in balance. The magnitude of what he was describing began to sink in. Margaret looked at her hands, soft from years of sewing and cooking and other domestic tasks. She looked at her swollen belly and felt the baby move inside her. 30 days to transform from a condemned prisoner into someone who could survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. "I don't know if I can do this," she said quietly. Dakota wrote, "You survived town that hated you, survived being sacrificed, survived night in desert, survived walk to cave, behind waterfall while pregnant. You are stronger than you know." He stood and offered his hand to help her up. Margaret took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. She noticed that his hands were marked with small scars, the accumulated damage of years lived rough. "We start now," he wrote. "First lesson, water." He led her out of the cave, back along that terrifying ledge behind the waterfall, Nash following close behind them. In daylight, the path looked even more dangerous than it had felt in darkness. Margaret could see the sheer drop to the churning pool below, could see exactly how narrow the ledge was, could see all the places where one wrong step would mean death. But she also saw the beauty. The waterfall caught the morning sunlight and threw rainbows across the canyon. The pool below was a deep turquoise, so clear she could see rocks on the bottom. Desert birds wheeled overhead, their calls echoing off stone walls. When they reached solid ground on the canyon floor, Dakota led her upstream from the waterfall. They walked for perhaps half a mile, Nash ranging ahead of them like a scout. Margaret's breath came harder than she liked, her pregnancy making any sustained walking difficult, but she refused to ask for rest. If she was going to survive the next 30 days, she needed to push past comfort. Dakota stopped at a place where the canyon wall showed a dark stain of moisture. He knelt and began digging at the base of the rock with a flat stone. After a few minutes of work, water began to seep into the depression he'd created. He waited until it had filled to a depth of perhaps 3 inches, then cupped his hands and drank. He gestured for Margaret to try. She knelt beside him and drank from the tiny spring. The water was cool and tasted strongly of minerals, but it was clean and abundant. Dakota wrote, "Canyon has 3 water sources. Waterfall Pool is easiest but most visible. This spring is hidden. Third source is 2 miles north, where Canyon splits. In summer, when pool goes low, these springs keep you alive. Must know where they are, must be able to find even in dark." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the canyon. Dakota showed her where beryl cacti grew, demonstrating how to cut into them to access the moisture inside. He showed her prickly pear cacti with fruit that was safe to eat once you removed the spines. He pointed out mesquite trees whose beans could be ground into flour. But he also showed her the dangers: a creosote bush whose leaves were poisonous, a beautiful purple flower that would cause violent illness if ingested, a type of cactus that looked similar to beryl cactus but contained toxic alkaloids instead of drinkable water. "How do you remember all this?" Margaret asked when they stopped to rest in the shade of an overhang. Dakota wrote, "Apache children learn from before they can walk. Plants are teachers. Animals are teachers. Rock and water and sky are teachers. You listen, you watch, you remember, or you die." The directness of it was almost refreshing after months of Copper Ridge's passive-aggressive hostility. Here the stakes were clear: learn or perish. No social niceties, no pretense, just the brutal honesty of survival. They returned to the cave as the sun reached its zenith. The temperature had climbed dramatically, and Margaret was grateful for the cool darkness of the stone chambers. Dakota built up the fire again and prepared a midday meal while Margaret collapsed on the blankets, exhausted. The baby was active, rolling and kicking in a way that made her entire belly shift shape. She watched the movements with a strange detachment. This child had been an abstract concept for so long, more a problem to be managed than an actual person. But here, with death such an immediate possibility, the baby suddenly felt terrifyingly real. "Dakota," she said, "what happens if I go into labor before the 30 days are up?" He paused in his cooking and wrote, "I helped Aida prepare for our son, learned from tribal midwives, know what to do, not as good as woman who has birthed before, but better than nothing. And if something goes wrong, if the baby is breech, or if I bleed too much, or—" He held up his hand, stopping her spiral of fear. He wrote, "Then we face it together. But worrying about future that has not happened steals strength from present that has. You need strength now, today, this moment. Future comes when it comes. It was practical wisdom delivered without sentimentality, and somehow that made it more comforting than any amount of false reassurance would have been. Margaret nodded and accepted the food he offered. As they ate, she found herself studying the drawings on the cave walls again. Aita's face, rendered over and over with loving attention to detail. In one of the sketches, she was laughing, her head thrown back in pure joy. Margaret found herself wondering what it would be like to be loved so completely that someone would spend 3 years drawing your face from memory. "Tell me about her," Margaret said. "About Aita. What was she like?" Dakota set down his food. He stared at the drawings for a long moment, then began to write. His hand moved slowly now, each word chosen carefully as if pulled from a deep well. She was light. When she entered room, darkness left. Not because she was loud or demanding attention, because she carried hope inside her like lamp that could not be extinguished. She believed people were good. Even when they proved her wrong, she believed they could become good. He turned to a new page. "She taught me English starting when I was 19. We would sit by river and she would point to things. Water, stone, bird, tree," I would repeat. She would laugh when I said words wrong, not mean laugh, happy laugh, like my mistakes were music. Another page. "We married when I was 20. Apache tradition and her choice. She could have chosen any man, warriors with more honor, better hunters, but she chose me. Said she saw something in me that even I did not see. Said I had gentle heart underneath warrior training. Said gentle hearts were rarest thing in violent world." His writing paused. When he continued, the letters were less steady. "When she became pregnant, she sang to baby every night. Apache songs mother taught her, Christian hymns missionaries taught her. Said baby should know all kinds of music, all kinds of hope. Our son would have been bridge between worlds, like her." He stopped writing and just sat there, staring at the page. Margaret saw a tear fall and hit the journal, making the charcoal run slightly. It was the first crack she'd seen in his careful control. "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. "I'm so sorry." Dakota wiped at his eyes quickly, as if angry at himself for showing emotion. He wrote, "Why do you apologize? You did not kill her. My husband did. The man I chose to love. That makes me complicit. No." Dakota underlined the word twice. "You did not know his heart. Aita taught me, we are not responsible for evil we did not commit. Only for evil we allow when we know it is happening." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "But I did know," she whispered. "Maybe not the full extent, but I knew he hated your people. I heard him talk about extermination, about how the only good Indian was a dead Indian. And I told myself it was just talk, just him working through childhood trauma. I convinced myself I could love the good parts and ignore the rest." Dakota set down his journal and charcoal. For the first time since meeting him, he made direct eye contact and held it. Then he did something that shocked Margaret to her core. He spoke. His voice was rusty from 3 years of disuse, rough and uncertain. But the words were clear enough. "You," he said, each syllable careful and deliberate, "are not your husband." Margaret stared at him. "You spoke." Dakota's hand flew to his mouth, his eyes wide with something like horror. He grabbed his journal and wrote frantically, "Did not mean to. Words came out. Broke vow. 3 years of silence broken." "Why is that bad?" Margaret asked. "Your voice is beautiful. Why should it be locked away?" But Dakota was backing away from her, his breathing quick and shallow. He wrote with shaking hands, "Spoke before. My words led to Aita's death. If I speak again might lead to more death. Safer to stay silent." "That's not how it works," Margaret said, standing and moving toward him. "Words are just tools. They can build or destroy depending on how you use them. Staying silent didn't bring Aita back. It just locked you in a prison of your own making." Dakota shook his head violently. He retreated to the back of the cave, putting distance between them. Nash following and whining softly as if sensing his master's distress. Margaret let him go. She understood shame well enough to know it couldn't be argued away with logic. Shame lived in the body, in the gut, in the place where reason didn't reach. He would have to work through this himself. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Dakota stayed in the back chambers of the cave, occasionally emerging to tend the fire or bring more wood. He wouldn't meet Margaret's eyes, and his journal stayed closed. Nash moved between them like a confused mediator, unsure which human needed comfort more. As evening approached and shadows began to fill the canyon, Margaret sat near the cave entrance and watched the sky change colors. The baby was quiet now, settled into whatever position it found comfortable. She placed both hands on her belly and thought about the future. 30 days to learn survival skills. 30 days to prove to an Apache council that she deserved to live. 30 days with a man who was so consumed by guilt that he'd locked away his own voice for 3 years. 30 days until she would either walk free or die, and the baby with her. James's ghost visited her thoughts as the sky turned purple and gold. Dead 4 months now, she had cried for him when she first heard the news, had mourned the loss of the future they'd planned together. But sitting here in this cave, watching the Arizona desert transform under twilight, she realized she had never really known the man she married. She had known the version of himself he presented to her, the charming officer who wrote poetry and quoted Shakespeare and made her feel like she was worth loving. She hadn't known the man who could order the massacre of women and children, who could look at pregnant Aida trying to warn people about danger and see only a target. That man had been a stranger wearing her husband's face. "I didn't know you," she whispered to his memory. "And maybe I didn't want to know you. Maybe I was so desperate for someone to love me that I ignored everything that should have been warning signs. But I know now. I see now. And I'm sorry for what you did. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stop you." The words felt like releasing something toxic she'd been holding inside. She couldn't change the past. Couldn't bring back Aida or her baby or the 27 other people who died at Fort Breckenridge, but she could refuse to carry James's guilt as her own. Behind her she heard movement. Dakota emerged from the back of the cave, Nash at his side. He approached slowly, his journal in hand. He sat down a few feet away from her and wrote for several minutes before showing her the page. "I am sorry for running away. Your words about my voice frightened me. I have held silence for so long that speaking feels like breaking sacred vow, like betraying Aida's memory. But maybe you are right. Maybe staying silent is prison I built for myself. Maybe Aida would not want me to live this way." He turned to a new page. "Tomorrow we continue lessons. Tonight I want to tell you something I have told no one, not even Nash." He wrote quickly now, as if the words had been building up pressure for years. "I am afraid. Afraid that if I speak again, I will say wrong things, hurt people with words the way my words hurt Aida. Afraid my tongue is weapon I cannot control. Afraid silence is only way to keep world safe from damage I cause." Margaret read the words twice, feeling the weight of fear that had shaped 3 years of this man's life. She understood it intimately. She had spent months afraid that speaking the truth about James would destroy her, that admitting she'd loved a monster would make her monstrous too. "I'm afraid too," she said softly. "I'm afraid I'll fail these tests. Afraid I'll die and my baby will die. Afraid that even if I survive, I'll never be able to forgive myself for the things I didn't do when I should have acted. But Dakota, we can't let fear turn us into ghosts. We're still alive. That means we still have choices." Dakota stared at what she'd said, then wrote, "What if we choose wrong again? Then we choose wrong, and we live with consequences. But at least we'll have chosen something instead of letting fear choose for us." They sat together as full darkness claimed the sky and stars emerged in their thousands. The waterfall's roar was a constant background music, white noise that somehow made conversation feel more intimate. Nash settled himself across both their laps, a warm bridge of fur and muscle and uncomplicated loyalty. Margaret found herself telling Dakota things she'd never told anyone. About growing up Irish in Denver, always slightly foreign, always slightly suspect. About her father dying when she was 12, leaving her and her mother to survive on sewing and washing clothes for rich families. About her mother's death from typhoid when Margaret was 17, leaving her completely alone in the world. About meeting James Sullivan at a church social, how he'd seemed like salvation, an officer with a steady salary, with prospects, with a future. How he'd courted her with poetry and promises. How she'd convinced herself that his occasional flashes of temper were just passion, that his hatred of Indians was just grief over his parents' deaths, that she could love him into being a better man. "But you can't love someone into changing," she said. "I understand that now. People only change when they want to change." And James never wanted to be anyone other than who he was. Dakota listened to all of it, occasionally writing questions or comments, but mostly just bearing witness to her story. When she finished, he wrote, "You blame yourself for loving wrong person. I blame myself for speaking wrong words. Maybe we are both trying to control things we never had power over. Maybe survival means accepting we are not responsible for everything that goes wrong in world." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, some knot she'd been carrying for months. Maybe you're right. They sat in companionable silence until Margaret's exhaustion became too heavy to fight. She moved to the blankets by the fire, and Dakota settled on his usual spot with Nash curled against him. But before she drifted off to sleep, she heard something that made her think she might be dreaming. Dakota's voice, rough and quiet, but unmistakably real, speaking 3 words into the darkness. "Good night, Margaret." She smiled into the firelight and whispered back, "Good night, Dakota." Outside, the desert night sang its ancient songs. Inside the cave, 2 broken people tried to believe they might heal. And somewhere in the space between them, hope flickered like a candle flame refusing to be extinguished. The 3rd day began with fire. Not a destructive blaze, but the careful, deliberate kind that separates the living from the dead in desert country. Dakota woke Margaret before dawn, the sky still holding on to darkness, like a secret. He handed her a bundle of dry grass, 2 sticks, and a flat piece of wood with a depression carved into its surface. He wrote in his journal by the light of the dying campfire, "Today you learn to make fire without my help, without matches, without steel. The way Apache children learn, the way you must know if you want to survive Council's test." Margaret looked at the materials in her hands, then at Dakota's expectant face. The baby shifted inside her, a rolling movement that made her entire belly ripple. She was 6.5 months pregnant, exhausted from 2 days of constant learning, and he wanted her to create fire from sticks. "I don't know if I can do this," she said. Dakota wrote, "You can. But first you must believe you can." Apache saying, "The body goes where the mind has already traveled. Your mind must see fire before your hands can make it." He demonstrated the technique with practiced efficiency. The vertical stick spun between his palms, its pointed end grinding into the depression on the flat wood. Smoke began to rise within seconds. He continued the motion, faster now, until a tiny ember glowed in the char. He transferred it carefully to the bundle of grass, blew gently, and flame erupted. Then he extinguished it and handed the materials to Margaret. She tried for 20 minutes before her hands began to blister. The stick slipped. The angle was wrong. Her palms couldn't maintain the speed needed to generate enough friction. Sweat ran down her face despite the morning chill. Her shoulders burned. The baby kicked as if protesting the motion. "I can't," she gasped, dropping the stick. Dakota picked it up and placed it back in her hands. He wrote, "Can't is word that kills faster than any weapon. Try again." Margaret wanted to throw the stick at him, wanted to scream that she was pregnant and exhausted, and this was impossible. But something in his steady gaze stopped her. He believed she could do this. More than that, he needed her to do this. Her survival depended on skills, not on his mercy. She tried again, and again and again. On her 43rd attempt, smoke rose from the wood. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped everything, but she forced herself to maintain the motion. The smoke thickened. An ember glowed. She transferred it to the grass bundle with trembling fingers and blew as Dakota had shown her. The grass smoldered. Then it caught. Flame bloomed in her hands like a miracle, like magic, like proof that impossible things could happen if you refused to accept defeat. Margaret stared at the fire she had created from nothing but friction and will, and felt tears stream down her face. Dakota was smiling. It was the first full smile she'd seen from him, transforming his face from neutral mask to something almost joyful. He wrote, "You did it. Now you do it 9 more times today until your hands remember even when your mind forgets." By the end of that day, Margaret's palms were raw and bleeding, but she could start a fire in under 5 minutes. Dakota wrapped her hands in strips of soft leather soaked in an herbal paste that smelled like mint and something sharper. The paste cooled the burning sensation almost immediately. "What is this?" she asked. He wrote, "Yarrow and aloe. Aida taught me. Good for burns and wounds. Canyon has yarrow growing near the North Spring. I will show you tomorrow." That night, as they ate roasted rabbit that Dakota had snared, Margaret asked the question that had been building in her mind for 3 days. "Why are you really doing this? I understand the council's decree. I understand that if I die, you're cursed. But you could just keep me alive with minimal effort. Instead, you're actually teaching me to survive. Why?" Dakota stared into the fire for a long time. When he finally wrote, the words came slowly, carefully, chosen. "Because 3 years ago, I could not save Aida, could not save my son, could not save myself from becoming thing I hated. I have been ghost for 3 years, not living, not dead, just existing. Teaching you to survive makes me feel alive again, makes me feel like maybe I am still worth something." He paused, then added, "Also, you are first person who has looked at me and seen person, not coward or ghost or shame. You gave me back my humanity. I want to give you your life. Seems like fair trade." Margaret felt her chest tighten with emotion. "You already had your humanity, Dakota. You just couldn't see it because you were looking through a lens of guilt, but it was always there." His hand moved to write again, but before he could put charcoal to paper, a sound froze them both. Footsteps outside the cave, human footsteps, moving with the deliberate quiet of someone who knew how to travel in hostile territory. Nash's head came up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Dakota stood in one fluid motion, moving to position himself between Margaret and the cave entrance. His hand went to the knife at his belt, the first time Margaret had seen him reach for a weapon. A figure appeared at the edge of the firelight, male, Apache, perhaps 30 years old, with 2 fingers missing from his left hand. His face was painted with symbols Margaret didn't recognize, and he carried a rifle slung across his back. He spoke in rapid Apache, his tone aggressive. Dakota responded in the same language, his voice still rough from disuse, but gaining strength with each word. The conversation grew heated, both men's voices rising. Finally, the stranger switched to English, his accent thick but understandable. "You protect white woman, Dakota, the widow of butcher who killed Aida. Have you lost all honor?" Margaret's blood turned to ice. This man knew who she was, knew about James. Dakota stepped forward, placing himself more squarely between the stranger and Margaret. He spoke in English now, perhaps for her benefit. "Chaska, brother of my heart, why do you come with anger?" "Council grows impatient," Chaska said, his eyes burning with barely contained rage. "Some say you have been corrupted by white woman. Say you protect her because she has bewitched you with pale skin and soft words." "Council gave me 30 days, Dakota replied, his voice steady despite the danger crackling in the air. "Only 10 days have passed. I follow Council's decree." Chaska's gaze shifted to Margaret. "You, white woman, you speak Apache?" Margaret's mind raced. Dakota had been teaching her phrases, basic words. She knew how to say water, food, child, thank you. She knew the words for sun and moon and stone. But could she string together anything coherent? She stood, her hands protectively over her belly, and spoke the words Dakota had taught her. She, Margaret, Shaye, Awe. I am Margaret. My baby is innocent. Something flickered in Chaska's expression. Surprise, perhaps. He hadn't expected her to know any Apache at all. You teach her our language? He said to Dakota, his voice softer now, but still edged with confusion. Why? Because language is bridge, Dakota replied. Aida believed this. She was right. If Margaret understands our words, she understands our hearts. If she survives 30 days, it should be because she earned survival, not because I kept her alive through pity. Chaska studied them both for a long moment. Then his gaze dropped to the marks on Margaret's hands, the fresh blisters and raw skin visible even in firelight. What happened to her hands? She learned to make fire today, the old way. Took her 43 tries, but she succeeded. For the first time, Chaska's hostile expression cracked slightly. Making fire the traditional way was notoriously difficult. That a pregnant white woman had managed it spoke to determination, not weakness. I killed your husband, Chaska said abruptly, looking directly at Margaret. I put arrow through Lieutenant Sullivan's throat, watched him drown in his own blood. It was justice for what he did to my people, to Dakota's wife, who was my sister. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Chaska was Aida's brother. The man standing before her had killed James. She should feel something, rage or grief or horror. Instead, she felt a strange, hollow acceptance. He deserved it, she said quietly, for what he did to your sister. To all the people at Fort Breckenridge, I didn't know the extent of his crimes when he was alive, but I know now, and I don't mourn him. I mourn the man I thought he was, but that man never existed. Chaska stared at her as if she'd just spoken in tongues. You agree that your husband's death was just? I agree that he murdered innocent people, including a pregnant woman who was trying to help settlers, not harm them. I agree that blood calls for blood in ways I don't fully understand but can't deny. I agree that if I had known what he was planning, I should have stopped him, and my failure to do so makes me complicit. Margaret took a shaky breath. But I also believe that my baby is innocent, and I believe that killing me won't bring your sister back or heal the wounds her death left behind. The cave fell silent except for the crackling fire and the endless roar of the waterfall outside. Chaska's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to track. Finally, he turned to Dakota. She is not like other whites, he said in Apache, then switched back to English. She has courage, and she speaks truth even when it condemns her. These are rare qualities in any person. He moved closer to the fire and sat, uninvited, but no longer overtly threatening. I came to warn you, brother. Not all of council is patient like father. There is one, Bidziel, cousin to me, and warrior of the old ways. He believes you have betrayed us by protecting her. He says that when 30 days end, he will challenge council's decision. He will demand her death and yours if you stand in the way. Dakota's jaw tightened. Bidziel lost his wife and daughter at Fort Breckenridge. His rage is understandable. Understandable, yes, but also dangerous. Chaska looked at Margaret again. You have 20 days left, white woman. Dakota can teach you survival skills, but can he teach you to face a man who wants to kill you? Can he teach you to stand before council and argue for your life in words they will respect? Margaret thought about that. About standing before a group of Apache elders whose people had been massacred by her husband's orders. About finding words that could bridge the gap between their grief and her guilt. About convincing them that mercy was stronger than revenge. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'm willing to try, I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to accept their judgment, even if it means my death, as long as my baby has a chance to live. Chaska stood. I will tell father you said this. It may help, or it may not, but at least you speak with honor. He looked at Dakota. You have chosen a hard path, brother. I hope the spirits guide you through it. He left as quietly as he'd arrived, disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight. Margaret realized she'd been holding her breath, and let it out in a rush. Her hands were shaking. Dakota sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He pulled out his journal and wrote, "You were brave. Spoke truth when lies would have been safer. Chaska respects that." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted. "I still am. This Bidzeel he mentioned, is he really going to try to kill me?" Dakota's expression darkened. He wrote, "Bidzeel is good man consumed by grief. He loved his family more than life. When they died, part of him died too. Now he lives only for revenge. Yes, he will try to kill you, and I will not let him succeed." The certainty in those words sent a chill through Margaret. She realized with sudden clarity that Dakota would die to protect her if it came to that. This man who had taken a vow of nonviolence, who had been exiled for refusing to kill, would break that vow if necessary to keep her alive. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me you won't throw your life away for mine. If it comes down to a choice between your death and mine, you choose to live. My baby needs someone to protect it if I die. You're the only person I trust to do that." Dakota stared at her, then wrote with fierce intensity, "I do not make promises I cannot keep. I cannot promise to let you die. Already lost Aita and my son. Will not lose another innocent person while I still breathe." They sat in silence, the weight of impossible choices hanging between them. Outside, the desert night sang with sounds both beautiful and threatening. Inside the cave, two people who had every reason to be enemies tried to figure out how to protect each other in a world determined to destroy them both. Margaret placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's movements. 20 days left until the council would judge her. 20 days to learn enough Apache to plead her case. 20 days to prepare for possible death while fighting desperately to live. She looked at Dakota, this silent man who was finding his voice again because of her, and made a decision. "Teach me," she said. "Teach me everything, not just survival skills. Teach me your language, your customs, your ways of seeing the world. If I'm going to stand before your council, I want to do it with understanding, not just fear. I want them to see that I'm willing to learn, willing to change, willing to become something more than just the widow of a murderer." Dakota studied her face in the firelight. Then he wrote, "It will be hard, harder than making fire, harder than anything you have done before. I know. You may still fail. Council may still condemn you. I know that too. But you want to try anyway?" Margaret met his eyes and held his gaze. "I want to try anyway, because trying means I still have hope. And hope is all I have left." Dakota closed his journal and set it aside. He spoke aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Then we begin tomorrow at dawn. I will teach you the words that matter. The words for honor and respect and courage. The words for mother and child and future. The words that might save your life." He paused, then added softly, "And maybe while I teach you to speak, you will teach me to hope again, because I have not hoped for anything in 3 years. But when I look at you fighting so hard to live, I remember what hope feels like, and it is good to remember." Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. She reached out and took Dakota's scarred hand in her own blistered one. Two souls bearing wounds no one else could see, holding on to each other in the darkness, believing against all evidence that maybe, just maybe, shattered things could mend if given enough time and care. The fire burned low, the waterfall sang its endless song, and somewhere in the space between fear and courage, hope took root and began to grow. The rattlesnake struck on day 15. Margaret had been gathering mesquite beans under Dakota's watchful instruction, her hands moving with growing confidence through the sun-warmed pods. The baby was restless that morning, shifting and rolling in ways that made her stop periodically to catch her breath. She was 7 months along now, her belly large enough that bending over required careful planning. She reached for a cluster of pods half hidden beneath a dried brush pile. The snake's rattle provided perhaps half a second of warning before fangs sank into her forearm just above the wrist. The pain was immediate and electric. shooting up her arm like liquid fire. Margaret screamed and stumbled backward, clutching her arm. The snake coiled and retreated, disappearing into the rocks with a final warning rattle. Dakota was beside her in seconds, Nash barking frantically. He grabbed her arm and examined the bite with the calm efficiency of someone who had dealt with this before. 2 puncture wounds welled blood. Already the surrounding skin was beginning to swell. He pulled his knife and Margaret's eyes widened in terror. But he didn't cut her. Instead, he sliced a strip from the bottom of his shirt and used it to tie a tourniquet above the bite, tight enough to slow the venom spread, but not so tight as to cut off circulation completely. Then he did something that made Margaret's stomach turn. He put his mouth directly over the bite and sucked hard, spitting blood and venom onto the ground. He repeated this 3 times, his face set in grim concentration. "The baby," Margaret gasped, panic rising in her throat. "Will the venom hurt the baby?" Dakota didn't waste time writing. He spoke aloud, his voice urgent but controlled. "Don't know. Need to get you to cave. Need herbs. Can you walk?" Margaret tried to take a step, and her knees buckled. The world tilted sideways, colors bleeding together. Dakota caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her with surprising strength. She was not a small woman, and 7 months pregnant she weighed considerably more than normal, but he carried her as if she weighed nothing at all. Nash ranged ahead of them as Dakota moved through the canyon at a pace that seemed impossible given the burden he carried. Margaret's arm throbbed with each heartbeat, the pain spreading up toward her shoulder. She could feel her pulse in the swollen tissue, could feel something wrong happening inside her body. "Talk to me," Dakota said, his breathing labored but steady. "Tell me something. Anything. Need to know you're conscious." "My mother," Margaret mumbled, her tongue feeling thick. "Used to sing when I was scared. Irish songs. About green hills and rain. I miss rain. So much dust here. So much heat." "Keep talking. What did songs sound like?" Margaret tried to remember the words, but they slipped away like water through her fingers. Instead, she hummed a melody, broken and off-key, the tune her mother had sung when Margaret was small, and the world was simple, and no one had died yet. The cave entrance loomed ahead. Dakota navigated the treacherous ledge behind the waterfall with Margaret in his arms, his feet finding purchase through memory and desperation. Once inside, he laid her on the blankets near the fire pit and immediately began pulling herbs from his carefully organized shelves. He worked with focused intensity, crushing leaves and roots in a stone bowl, adding water to make a thick paste. All the while he talked to her, keeping her engaged, fighting the drowsiness that was trying to pull her under. "This is yarrow mixed with crushed plantain leaf and activated charcoal from fire. Will draw out venom. Will hurt when I apply it. You understand?" Margaret nodded weakly. She watched as he spread the paste over the bite, pressing it into the wounds. The pain was extraordinary, sharp enough to make her cry out. But underneath the pain, she felt something else. A cooling sensation, a slight easing of the burning. Dakota wrapped her arm in clean cloth, then elevated it on a rolled blanket. He checked the tourniquet and loosened it slightly. His hands were shaking, she realized. For all his calm efficiency, he was terrified. "The baby," she said again. "Is it moving? I can't tell. Everything hurts." Dakota placed his hand on her swollen belly and waited. Margaret saw his expression shift from fear to relief. "Moving," he said. "Strong movements. Baby is fighter like mother." He sat beside her and pulled her head into his lap, supporting her as he held a water skin to her lips. "Drink, small sips. Venom makes you dehydrated. Need to flush poison from body." Margaret drank, the water tasting of minerals and stone and life. She felt consciousness slipping, pulling her down into darkness that seemed both terrifying and inviting. "Don't let me sleep," she mumbled. "Read somewhere you're not supposed to sleep with snake venom." "That's for head injuries," Dakota said gently. "Sleep is good for snake bite. Body heals while you rest. I will watch you. We'll wake you every hour to drink water and check on baby. I promise you are safe." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to stay awake and alert, but her body had other ideas. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was Dakota's voice, rough and worried, speaking words in Apache that sounded like prayers. She woke to firelight and pain. Her arm felt like it was being crushed in a vice, the swelling so severe that the skin was stretched tight and shiny. Dakota was pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, his face drawn with exhaustion. "How long?" she asked, her voice a croak. 14 hours. You woke 3 times but do not remember. Fever broke 1 hour ago. Swelling is starting to go down. You will live." Margaret tried to sit up, and the world spun violently. Dakota eased her back down. "Slowly. Body has been through battle. Need time to recover. The baby? Still moving. Still strong. I have been monitoring, talking to your belly, telling your child stories about mother who is too stubborn to let a snake kill her." Despite everything, Margaret smiled. "What stories?" "Told baby about fire making, about learning Apache words faster than any adult I have seen, about facing Chaska with courage when most people would have begged for mercy." He paused, his hand resting on her belly. "Told baby that mother is strongest person I have ever known, stronger than warriors, stronger than grief, strong enough to survive anything." Tears leaked from Margaret's eyes. She was so tired of crying, but the tears came anyway. "I don't feel strong. I feel terrified every moment of every day." "Fear and strength are not opposites," Dakota said quietly. "Bravery is not absence of fear, is choosing to move forward even when you are afraid. You do this every day. That is strength." He helped her sit up enough to drink more water and eat a little broth he'd made from herbs and dried meat. The food settled her stomach, which had been churning with nausea. As she ate, she noticed something different about the cave. New drawings covered sections of the wall she was certain had been blank before. Charcoal sketches, rough but recognizable. A woman with long hair, but not Aita's face. This woman had softer features, rounder cheeks, and even in the simple lines, Margaret could see herself. "You drew me?" she asked. Dakota followed her gaze to the sketches. Color rose in his cheeks, barely visible in the firelight, but there nonetheless. "You were unconscious for 14 hours. I was terrified you would die, terrified baby would die, needed to do something with my hands to keep from going mad with worry. Drawing helps me think, helps me process fear." Margaret studied the images. In some, she was gathering plants. In others, she was making fire. In one, she sat by the fire with her hand on her belly, a small smile on her face. He had captured something in that sketch, some quality of determination mixed with tenderness that Margaret hadn't known she possessed. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "Is this how you see me?" "This is how you are," Dakota corrected. "Strong and gentle at same time. Fierce when protecting your child, but kind when speaking about people who have hurt you. You contain contradictions. That makes you interesting to draw." He helped her lie back down, adjusting the blankets around her. "You need to rest more. Venom is mostly out of system, but body is exhausted from fighting it. Sleep. I will watch over you." "Will you tell me about Aita?" Margaret asked, fighting the drowsiness that was pulling at her. "Not about how she died, about how she lived, what made her laugh, what she dreamed about." Dakota settled beside her, his back against the cave wall. He was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice soft and full of memory. She laughed at everything, found joy in smallest things, a bird landing nearby, the way sunlight hit water, the taste of mesquite honey. She said life was too short to spend it serious all the time. He smiled, a distant expression that spoke of love that hadn't died with death. She used to collect stones, smooth ones from the river, would arrange them in patterns and tell me they were teaching her mathematics. I did not understand how rocks could teach anything, but she would explain about ratios and proportions and sacred geometry until my head spun. She sounds brilliant. She was. Too brilliant for someone like me. I was just warrior, knew how to track, how to hunt, how to fight. but she saw something in me I did not see in myself, said I had gentle soul underneath the training, said that was rare and precious. He fell silent, lost in memory. Margaret watched his face in the firelight, seeing the pain that lived there alongside the love. She understood now why he had drawn Aita's face so many times. It wasn't morbid obsession, it was love refusing to let memory fade. "What did she dream about?" Margaret prompted gently. "Peace," Dakota said immediately. She dreamed of a world where Apache children and white children could play together without fear, where people judged each other by character, not by skin color or tribal affiliation. She believed it was possible if enough people chose compassion over revenge. His voice broke slightly. She died trying to make that dream real, died trying to warn white settlers about raid, died believing in goodness of people who shot her without asking questions. "Her dream didn't die with her," Margaret said. "You're keeping it alive, teaching me, protecting me, choosing mercy over revenge. That's her dream living on through you." Dakota looked at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You think so?" "I know so, and I think she would be proud of you." He wiped at his eyes quickly, embarrassed by his emotion. "Rest now. We will talk more when you are stronger." But before Margaret could close her eyes, a sound froze them both. Voices outside the cave. Multiple voices, speaking Apache in tones that ranged from angry to uncertain. Dakota was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between Margaret and the cave entrance. Nash growled low in his throat, hackles raised. 3 Apache warriors appeared at the edge of the firelight. Margaret recognized Chaska immediately. The other 2 were strangers, both older, both carrying weapons. One of them had a face twisted by old burn scars, his expression radiating barely controlled fury. Chaska spoke first, his voice formal and strained. "Dakota, we come with message from council. These are Elder Nalnish, my father, and Bidzil, who has right to speak for the dead." The man Dakota had told her about, the one who wanted her dead. Dakota's hand moved to his knife, not drawing it, but ready. He spoke in Apache, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Margaret couldn't understand all the words, but she caught enough to know he was defending her presence, explaining about the snake bite, asserting his right to protect her during the 30-day trial period. Bidzil responded with a string of words that sounded like accusations. His hand gestured violently toward Margaret, and she didn't need translation to understand his rage. Then the third man spoke, his voice carrying an authority that silenced both Dakota and Bidzil. This was Nalnish, Margaret realized, chief of the Apache band, father to both Chaska and the dead Aita, the man who had sent the ultimatum that led to her being given to Dakota. He was perhaps 60, his long hair streaked with gray, his face lined with the accumulated weight of leadership and loss. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing as they moved from Dakota to Margaret and back again. He spoke in English, his accent minimal, his words chosen with precision. "Margaret Sullivan, you are awake. That is good. I was told you might not survive the snake bite." Margaret struggled to sit up despite the pain. She would not face this man lying down like an invalid. Dakota moved to help her, and Nalnish's eyes tracked the gesture with interest. "I survived," Margaret said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Your son taught me well. He saved my life." "Your son?" Bidzil spat the words. "Dakota is not your son, Nalnish. He married your daughter. That does not make him blood." Nalnish turned to Bidzil with a look that could have frozen fire. "Aita chose him. That made him my son in all ways that matter, and he honors her memory by choosing mercy over murder, something you should consider." Bidzil's scarred face flushed with anger. "Mercy? You call protecting the widow of the butcher mercy? Sullivan killed my wife and daughter, killed Aita and her unborn child, killed 27 of our people. And you speak of mercy?" The pain in his voice was so raw that Margaret felt it like a physical blow. This was not just anger. This was grief so profound it had transformed into something corrosive and consuming. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, the words inadequate, but all she had. "I'm sorry for what my husband did. I'm sorry for your wife and daughter. I'm sorry for all the pain he caused. If I could bring them back, I would. If I could have stopped him, I would have. But I can't change the past. I can only try to be better than he was." Bidzil stared at her as if she'd just spoken in tongues. "You apologize? You think words can replace my family?" "No," Margaret said quietly. "Nothing can replace them. But maybe, if I survive the next 15 days, I can honor their memory by teaching my child about the cost of hatred, by making sure the next generation learns from our mistakes instead of repeating them." The cave fell silent except for the crackling fire and the distant roar of the waterfall. Nalnish studied Margaret with an expression she couldn't read. Chaska looked between his father and Bidzil with obvious concern, and Takoda stood tense and ready, prepared to fight his own people if they moved against her. Finally Nalnish spoke. "I came here to see if what I was told was true, that Takoda has been teaching you our language, our customs, our ways of survival." Chaska said it was so, but I needed to see with my own eyes. He stepped closer, and Margaret forced herself not to flinch away. "Speak to me in Apache. Show me what you have learned." Margaret's mind raced. 15 days of lessons. A vocabulary memorized while her hands learned to make fire and her body learned to navigate hostile terrain. She searched for words that would matter, that would show respect rather than just basic comprehension. She spoke slowly, carefully pronouncing each word as Takoda had taught her. "She Margaret, she awe ba nihi, she kadshikai, Takoda, aita bi bike nisha, ba ahe nisin." I am Margaret. I carry child inside me. I am friend to Takoda. I walk in Aita's footsteps. I want to give thanks. It was clumsy, grammatically imperfect, probably missing nuance that a native speaker would catch immediately. But she saw Nalnish's eyebrows rise slightly, saw something shift in his expression. "You speak of walking in my daughter's footsteps," he said in English. "That is either great courage or great foolishness. Which do you think it is?" "Both," Margaret said honestly. "I'm foolish enough to hope that mercy is stronger than revenge, and I'm courageous enough to keep hoping even when everything suggests I'm wrong." Nalnish turned to Takoda. "You have taught her well. Not just words, but philosophy. She sounds like Aita when she speaks about hope and mercy." "Because Aita was right," Takoda said, his voice firm despite the danger of contradicting a chief. "She believed peace was possible. She died trying to make it real. I will not dishonor her memory by becoming the thing that killed her. I choose her path, even if it means standing alone." "You do not stand alone," Chaska said quietly. He stepped forward to stand beside Takoda, a gesture of solidarity that made Bidzil snarl with rage. "You betray your own sister's memory?" Bidzil demanded. "I honor it," Chaska replied. "Aita would not want this woman's death. She would want exactly what is happening here. Teaching instead of killing. Understanding instead of revenge. My sister believed in bridges between worlds. This woman is trying to become that bridge. I will not destroy her for trying." Bidzil looked between them all, his scarred face twisted with emotions too complex to name. "You are all fools, soft and weak and corrupted by white lies. When 30 days end, I will demand council vote for her death. And when I do, remember that I warned you. Remember that mercy shown to enemies is cruelty shown to your own people." He turned and stalked out of the cave, his footsteps echoing off stone. The silence he left behind was thick with tension and unresolved conflict. Nalnish watched him go, then turned back to Margaret and Takoda. "Bidzil speaks from grief, but he is not wrong to question. The council is divided. Some, like Chaska and myself, see possibility for new path forward. Others, like Bidzil, see only betrayal and weakness." He moved closer to Margaret, close enough that she could see the network of fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his hair. You have 15 days remaining. In that time, you must learn not just survival skills and language. You must learn our laws, our values, what we hold sacred and why. Because when you stand before council, they will test not just your ability to survive in desert, they will test your understanding of Apache heart. Do you understand? Yes, Margaret said, and I'm willing to learn. I want to understand. Nalnish nodded slowly. Then learn well, because your life and your child's life will depend on it. He looked at Dakota. You have chosen difficult path, son. I hope you are strong enough to walk it to the end. I am, Dakota said without hesitation. We shall see. Naalnish gestured to Chaska, and together they left the cave, leaving Dakota and Margaret alone with Nash and the dancing firelight. Margaret's arm throbbed with renewed pain, and exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She had survived a rattlesnake and a confrontation with Apache warriors in the same day. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt the weight of 15 days pressing down on her like a physical force. Dakota knelt beside her, his hand checking her forehead for fever. You need rest, real rest. Tomorrow we continue lessons, but tonight you heal. Will I survive this? Margaret asked, the question encompassing more than just the snake bite. Will they let me live? Dakota met her eyes, and she saw both fear and determination in his gaze. I do not know, but I know we will fight with everything we have. And sometimes that is enough. He helped her lie down, adjusting the blankets around her with gentle care. As Margaret drifted toward sleep, she heard him speaking softly in Apache, words she didn't yet know, but whose tone spoke of prayer or promise or perhaps both. Outside, the desert night pressed close. Inside the cave, hope and fear danced together like firelight and shadow, inseparable and eternal. And in the space between them, a child moved in its mother's womb, innocent and unaware that its very existence had become a battleground where mercy and justice fought for supremacy. 15 days remained, 15 days to transform fear into understanding, guilt into redemption, hatred into something that might, if they were very lucky and very brave, resemble forgiveness. The fire burned low, the waterfall sang on, and two wounded spirits, one who had lost his voice to grief, one who had lost her name to shame, clung to hope with the desperate grip of those who know that surrender is the only true defeat.